There was a study that came out recently and it's a correlation study, it can only be that showed that in the decade before Paris, 2015, the level of emissions were increasing at a much faster rate than they were in the decade since. Again, you can argue whether or not Paris had a direct impact on that, but at least it suggested that it did. Obviously, nobody is suggesting that's sufficient, but it may well have had some positive impact. Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmons. I'm the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future. And this is coming to you, or will be coming to you, early in November. What does that mean? If you're a climate hawk who pays attention, you know that it comes just before the annual meeting called the Conference of the Parties, where the entire world, it seems, gets together to talk about what's happening in climate and what needs to be done and how we could get it done. This year will be the 30th such meeting, which is why it's simply called COP30. And our program is simply What's Up with COP30. At the Climate Emergency Forum, we've developed quite a track record, if you will, of both attending these sessions, many of us, Paul and Charles and Heidi, myself and others, and reporting from the COPs. We won't be there in person this year, but we've always done pre-COPs like today's. This is our fifth one. So I'm eager and excited to hear what our two regular panelists, Peter Carter and Paul Beckwith, will have to say about the Belém, Brazil COP. Basically, there are a whole bunch of issues that come up every year that will be coming up again this year, and they often come up because they don't get resolved in the previous years. It's finance, it's achieving decarbonization, which is the most fundamental thing. This year we'll be looking at adaptation, in particular, adaptation policies, adaptation finance. There's for the second time, a huge absence of the United States and what that may mean for the rest of the world, fossil fuel phase out, and the fact that this is the first COP that it will be held on the fringes and the edge, rather, of the Amazon River basin. So lots of good and juicy ideas and topics to get to. And so let me not take any further time, but rather introduce Dr. Peter Carter. Peter, as our regulars know, lives in the western part of Canada, in British Columbia. He's a retired medical doctor. He's been an IPCC expert reviewer, and he started the Climate Emergency Institute. And Peter, the floor is yours, and I know you've been particularly a student of COPs. You've looked at them very carefully and closely for many years. Give us your initial take on what we might expect this year.
Yeah, thanks, Herb. Of course, I go back rather a long way. I can remember very, very well the 1992, the signing of the 1992 UN Climate Change Convention, agreed to in Rio de Janeiro, which is interesting. It's not working, right? We've had 30 years of these conventions, huge gatherings of people. And as Herb says, we're no further ahead at all. But on our emissions, right, we're way, way, way backward. I'm gonna read a few quotes from the convention, because the convention is a darn good convention. It's not because there's a convention that the COPs don't work. Primarily, the main thing is that the process is not democratic. The public has absolutely no input into these conferences and into their decisions. It's all decided by the leaders of nation states. So probably not surprising nothing's happening. Now, the convention says some very important things. For example, it says the convention is determined to protect the climate system for present and future generations. Have we done that? Absolutely not. Apparently, we don't even consider them. Just yesterday, we had the report published by the UN Climate Secretariat of the estimate of what the new NDCs, those are just national emissions targets, will do. But that was already a lost cause because only 64 of the countries, 190 or what, have submitted their updated targets. And they were supposed to have submitted them months ago. None of the large emitters have submitted. Of course, the US hasn't, we know that. China, of course, very much the largest emitter, has not submitted. India has not submitted. Indonesia has not submitted. These are all countries with very, very large fossil fuel emissions. Surprisingly, Russia has submitted. So there you go. So these only represent 30% of global emissions. So officially at least, we don't know. We're in the dark about how much warming we're going to get from the so-called pledges. But from the European Commission earlier this year that did do an assessment, we're looking at 2.6 degrees C, still absolute total planetary catastrophe. However, what we do know, but which has never been used, is the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. And they lead to about 3 degrees C. And they are the metric used by the convention, which has never, ever been used. So people still don't know the terms of the convention, but apparently they didn't know it a few years after it was signed. So the objective of the convention is that, and any legal instruments, protocols, etc., agreed on subsequent to the convention are still based on this convention. Paris is still based legally on the convention. So the objective is to stabilize atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. That makes perfect sense by the science. Global warming does not really, in accordance, and that has to prevent what's called dangerous interference of the climate system, and that is defined. This is really, really important. Such a level should be achieved within a time frame to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally. The coral reefs are finished. The tropical rainforests are on the way to being finished. And most importantly, to ensure that food production is not threatened, right? And everybody knows that it's threatened. They gave a list, actually, of the most vulnerable countries, an itemized list that I don't have time to read out, but all of the most vulnerable countries are specifically named in the convention. The other thing is that relates to this is not a democratic process. The public does not have input. The public also really has not been informed properly. And the convention says that the parties would promote and cooperate in education, training, and public awareness related to climate change and encourage the widest participation in the process. So, in summary, the 1992 convention is a darn good convention. Unfortunately, people don't really know about it very well. And again, at the moment, with only pathetic 64 countries submitting. I guess my final word would be everything here is decided by nation states, and nation states do not make good decisions, certainly from the point of view of the environment, certainly not from the point of view of the future.
Thank you, Peter, for such a incisive, albeit bleak assessment, but an accurate one, I would certainly conclude, of where we stand with respect to this COP and future and past COPs and what the sort of the goal, the original goal was. You know, you mentioned about there's not that much democratic participation. Well, there seems to be a lot of democratic participation by one sector, at least in recent past COPs. Oftentimes the largest delegations were those of the fossil fuel industry. So they seem to be able to democratize their industry to have adequate representation, even if the rest of us were shut out to some degree or other. With that, always happy to introduce Paul Beckwith. Paul, as you know, is a climate system scientist who lives in Ottawa. He's taught at universities in the Ottawa area, and he has a very prolific YouTube channel with over 1,500 videos and millions of viewers. Paul, you've been a veteran, having attended COPs and having written about them and thought about them probably for a good chunk of your adult life. What's your assessment?
Thank you, Herb, and thank you, Peter. So I'm sipping water right now from a water bottle. It says COP29, Baku, Azerbaijan. I have several of these bottles. So people, 60,000 people go to these conferences now to get their free water bottles, I think. Yeah, it's become a very wieldy conference. I can understand why people go. If you're in climate science, it's the largest one in the world every year. It happens the same time every year, so people can plan ahead for it. But there's just, and also people that go, once they go, they kind of get the formula for getting access to badges, and then the following year they want to go again and invite a bunch of their friends and get more and more people, and then it just cascades. So, the process has just become too unwieldy. Most people that attend the COPs have no influence or connection to the actual talks and discussions. Each country puts together delegates who go. Unfortunately, most of the negotiation sessions are closed to the general public. They're also closed to the vast majority of people that attend the COPs aren't able to attend the negotiation sessions. And if they are, they better sit at the back and keep quiet. It's just the country delegates that talk. So there is no public input to the actual conference. At the conference, the country delegates are directed by their governments, and hopefully some of their policies and statements are based on what people in their country tell them. But that's not clearly the case, since there's an awful lot of lobbying from fossil fuel industry and plastics industries and other groups which want to impede progress. And we've clearly not seen progress, as Peter has stressed. I mean, when we say we haven't, I mean, greenhouse gases are still rising at accelerating rates. Warming has spiked up. There's lots of tipping points, of course, hitting our planet hard. Maybe things would have been worse without the COPs and without all these negotiations, right? Maybe things would be twice as bad. But, all of these conferences, negotiations, and discussions have not been able to turn things around. And now it's a big deal for a country to hold a COP because it brings in lots of dollars with all these delegates. So, you have to really question the purpose of the whole thing. To give this year's example of Belém, in the rainforest, Brazil, the actual town just wasn't suitable for holding the COP. A lot of local people have been harmed by the COP before it even starts. People that are renting places in apartments, etc., near the conference site have been forced out of their homes. These are long-term tenants. They might have been there a decade even. They're forced out of where they live so that their landlords can go and rent at top dollar to delegates that come in. So they've kicked people out of their homes. They've actually constructed I believe, a 6-lane highway through parts of the jungle connecting two parts of the town to each other. So several kilometer long highway, constructed specifically to deal with the COP, from what I've heard. That happened earlier this year. Cruise boats are in the harbor, even people coming, the rents for accommodation are exorbitant. In Baku, Azerbaijan last year, I showed up for 2 weeks to the COP and went to my Airbnb accommodation, and the landlord said, "Oh, it's no longer available." So gave me another address, which I couldn't find that night. When I investigated the next morning, it was like the worst possible accommodation, cinder block, plywood door, no hot water, washroom outside. It was really bad conditions. This is Airbnb. There's a lot of problems as a result of the expense. Lots of countries are not sending delegates this year, right? Many countries from the Southern Hemisphere that should absolutely need a position at the table at the negotiations just aren't attending because the countries can't afford to send people. So that's the situation that we're in. I think the whole idea of these conferences needs to go through a big rethink.
Thanks, Paul. And having been in Baku with you, I can empathize and appreciate what you're saying about the accommodations, but we'll save the rest of that discussion for another time. Just a couple quick comments on what Peter and Paul have said. There was a study that came out recently that and it's a correlation study, it can only be that, that showed that in the decade before Paris, 2015, the level of emissions were increasing at a much faster rate than they were in the decade since. Again, you can argue whether or not Paris had a direct impact on that, but at least it suggested that it did. Obviously, nobody is suggesting that's sufficient, but it may well have had some positive impact. And of course, you never know about all the interactions, the impacts that occur from the connections that are made between people and countries in 2 weeks of hanging out and having meals and all the rest of that, and all the bilateral and multilateral, what I call climate lateral negotiations that occur and agreements that are made that in many cases can be as significant as the national agreements. The last thing I'll say, when we get to the question of democracy, on one level, you could argue that they're remarkably democratic in the sense that by requiring unanimity and consensus, the smallest of countries has as much of a say, at least in theory, as the largest countries. And then a lot of other people argue that, well, that means you can't get anything done, because if everybody has to agree on everything, you wound up having to stay in your hotel 2 extra nights because you're negotiating till 3 in the morning to get that last country to agree. These are extremely tricky and difficult, situations that we find ourselves in. And with that, back to Peter.
Yeah, these conferences with the tens of thousands of people attending, for years I've regarded them as a circus, basically. So not only is the process not democratic, but the conferences actually are contrary to democracy and public awareness, because the average person, or the public, of course, thinks that with all these big conferences every year, the governments are doing something. Well, they're not. What the governments are doing is they're stopping anything happening with regards to climate change mitigation and emissions. They're set up to fail, as I've several times explained, and they're set up to fail because they have this extraordinary definition of consensus. I should point out that the General Assembly, for decisions of what they call great importance, they have a 2/3 majority, right? And this was, of course, recommended in the early days of the convention. But what happened was that Saudi Arabia and the buddies said, no, 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 we don't want that. We'd be happy with everybody has to agree. Well, obviously, then you can't make any progress because you've got several countries that are highly dependent on fossil fuels and produce huge amounts of fossil fuels. So this conference process is basically hijacked by the fossil fuel industry. That's really what's happened, when it's really what it gets down to. I just want to point out another couple of things that may be misapprehensions a bit. With many people, I was kind of very pleased with COP28, a couple of years ago, because we were told that it was the beginning of the end of fossil fuels and the countries had agreed to phase out fossil fuels. No, absolutely not. I reread the stock take from COP28, and there's no commitment whatsoever from that to. So again, it was a pretense. So what we're given here over and over is a pretense that things are happening and things are not happening. The conference process has been hijacked and it is controlled by the fossil fuel industry in partnership with the governments, I might say.
Thank you, Peter. One of the things, I mean, you're correct at the big level. What we're talking about is the power imbalance at the international level that, of course, is reflected in probably every international negotiation, whether it's on trade or minerals or whatever. And why would it be any different for climate? Again, that's not a justification or an excuse, but the COPs reflect the state of the world's geopolitical situation. And that's the reality of governing 8 billion people. They're attempting to. And, it strikes me that one of the opportunities, at least with the connections that modern technology gives us, is the opportunity to have millions of people participate virtually through voting, through discussion groups and whatever, which, didn't exist even 10 years ago when Paris occurred. This is all very, very new, or at least not to the degree to which it has right now. I would love to see between now and the next COP, the UN work with willing countries to find a way to involve millions of people, to educate them, to involve them, and to have them directly or indirectly participate, because that's now technologically more feasible. And, again, because of the problems these host cities have in hosting these meetings for, one reason or another, a virtual alternative, while not optimal, seems to me to be something that's worth exploring. So with that, let me turn it back to Paul for any concluding thoughts you have.
I talked a bit about the downsides, the size of the COP and, the results that are achieved, and it's becoming unwieldy. Obviously, I think those things can be addressed by the UN, putting some rules in on running the conference, restricting the number of delegates from each country, et cetera. Things like that, could reduce the numbers. But, on the plus side, I mean, when a person goes to a COP, they typically come away with, personally, they come away with a good impression because, you get exposed to cultures from a lot of different countries. You meet a lot of people that you wouldn't meet otherwise. Some of the big names in climate, some of the top scientists or, famous people from different countries are there. You often get a glimpse of them in the hallways, et cetera, of the conference. You're exposed to a new culture. You come away kind of inspired. Sometimes climate advocacy, climate activism, is tough. It's tough to do. So I find, the cops are generally, I think, morale boosters for a lot of people on a personal level. So, they continue to go. It's just that the way the format, the way that they do things could, I think, be better. There is value to the conference, but it looks like a lot of the value is being challenged by the unwieldiness and the inability to, reduce fossil fuels, for example. But as you say, this is a geopolitical sort of global thing that's going on. My personal view is, at this stage, I think to really keep hoping that governments are going to do the right thing and that fossil fuels are going to be reduced, it's difficult to be optimistic about that, which is why I often talk about the three-legged bar stool. You call it the triad. If we're not going to cut down and reduce fossil fuels in any significant amount at any rate that's fast enough to stop this out of control temperature and feedbacks in our climate system, then we don't have any other option but to figure out ways to remove vast amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. And there are hopeful ways to do that using, nature assisted ways. And also, we need to research the heck out of solar radiation management or methods, solar radiation methods like stratospheric aerosol injection, for example, which we know can cool the planet. I mean, we know it happens whenever a large volcano goes off. So we need to really look at these things and weigh the risks of those with the risks of where we're heading without. And we're clearly seeing that business as usual is sending our temperatures skyrocketing, our extreme weather events skyrocketing, and harming many people around the planet and infrastructure. And, it is an existential threat, not just to our civilizations, to our way of life, but also, very life itself.
Well said, Paul. And I think it's fair to say that in the official proceedings at the last few COPs, or indeed any COP, that third leg of your bar stool or of the triad is in the official proceedings almost entirely ignored. It's not talked about solar radiation management, sunlight reflection, whatever terms, and there are many alternative terms. And I myself am very, how do I say this? But I'm very proud of the work that you all have done, we all have done at the Climate Emergency Forum in Baku and at previous COPs of spotlighting some of the experts on cooling techniques to have press conferences and programs like this direct from the COPs. I scratch my head when I think, we may have had as many programs as the rest of the COP put together on stratospheric injection in Baku. What will happen in Belém remains to be seen, but it's critical that this issue get on the agenda. So as we wrap it up, thanks as always to Peter and Paul. For our viewers, the important thing is, notwithstanding some of the disappointments that we've all articulated today, there's a lot that goes on. There are a lot of surprises, positive and negative. Please keep focused on the COP. There are all sorts of announcements every day of nations and industries announcing this and that, some of which are real, some of which are maybe just PR smoke. But keep track of all that kind of stuff. There'll be very important discussions to see whether the richer countries can finally be willing to pry open their coffers a little bit in terms of climate finance. There are important discussions on adaptation. There's been a 2-year process to develop indicators to help countries better adapt, which we clearly have to do, whatever else we do on emissions or cooling. So there's lots of really important things that are occurring. Stay in touch with us. Keep an eye on COP. We'll continue to report on it. I'm sure we'll do a program post-COP that wraps up what we saw is happening and gives you our impressions. And we'll be eager to hear yours as well. And before I wrap up, as we've done the last few weeks or so, I'd just like to briefly present a few sort of climate headlines from the past week, what I'm now calling the Climate Five. Number one, not necessarily in order of importance, The Lancet, which is a medical journal and organization, had a study they released called the Lancet Countdown, where they estimated that one person a minute dies from climate change, which turns out to be over 500,000 people a year or so. Obviously, that's not super precise, but it gives you some order of magnitude sense of the Holocaust scale catastrophe that's already happening, often something we don't hear about. A Nature Communications academic paper was released saying that if the world continues at high emission levels of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, there will be what they call a European monsoon-like climate in what they call a warm house world, not a hothouse world, but a warm house world. Another sobering report. One of the world's richest and most prominent men, Bill Gates, who has been a climate advocate for better or worse for many years, just announced that he is not as concerned about climate change as he used to be. I would encourage you to look at his comments and his report. I found it a bit depressing, but seems to reflect the zeitgeist that's out there in the world about climate change. There was another study that looked at the connection on social media between climate anxiety, climate doomism, and radical action. And they found that people who were doomers on social media were much more supportive of such things as sabotage, threatening CEOs, wrecking fossil fuel cyber infrastructure, and other direct action. They didn't say what percentage of people on social media believe that or how the correlation works. And lastly, in a bit of interesting good news coming from Scotland, they have a program that they call Cool Cows. And the Cool Cow program is they are breeding cows to emit less methane when they burp. And they have projected that with the breeding that they have successfully done so far in the coming years or so, they expect in another decade or so to have cows that will emit 40% less methane. And cows are a major, major source of methane, which is one of the most damaging greenhouse gases, more damaging on a molecular scale by far than carbon dioxide. Next time you're in Scotland, see if you can go out in the country and find a cool cow to embrace or thank for their efforts. With that, I want to thank everybody again. Hope you again follow COP as it starts. Probably a day or so after this program will appear. And as always, if you like our channel and our program, please do so. Subscribe to our channel. Go to our website, theclimateemergencyforum.org. If you find that little round button that says donate, we'd appreciate if you press it and give what you can so that we can continue. We've already done well over 200 programs, and we hope and intend to do many, many more. Leave us your comments, your suggestions for future programs, and as always, we will see you next week. Thanks so much.